Hi, and welcome to the Human Systems Intervention Channel. I'm James Conklin. I'm a professor at Concordia University, a researcher at the Bruyère Research Institute, and in whatever time is left over, I sometimes work as an independent consultant. Today I'm going to be talking to Emma Sobel. Emma is a graduate of the Human Systems Intervention Program at Concordia University, and she's been working as a consultant for some years now in the field of organizational change. She's very experienced in the methodologies of TOP, the technology of participation, a particular approach to facilitation. And she has also got a lot of experience in working with large organizations such as universities and large healthcare organizations who are interested in altering their culture, changing their way of being and their way of acting. And she's going to talk about her approach today, which she refers to as stealth consulting. Okay, Emma. Well, thanks very much. I really appreciate you being here today and joining me. And I understand that what you're going to do is you're going to talk to us about overcoming organizational barriers using stealth. So I'm really intrigued by that, and curious what you're getting at here.
Okay, so I'm using stealth. Sometimes I call it ninja change, and it is about entry into an organization and how to quietly create the conditions for change, really without anybody noticing, so that by the time the organization is ready for it, you are prepared to go forward and have change happen in a not so stealthy way. But I think part of the temptation when you've gotten a new job, it's maybe as an organizational change agent in a big organization, is to come in with guns blazing and prove yourself right away. And that is because part of the culture we have is to demonstrate your value as quickly as possible, and that's measured in praise from authority or tangible, measurable deliverables. And so the temptation is to do that. And I have found that if you do that quickly, you get to a point at about 6 months where that can backfire on you, because you hit a point where people weren't ready for the change and then feel that that change is being imposed upon them and resist. Okay. Whereas if you go a little bit more quietly, and without needing to prove right away what you're doing, but engaging people and quietly building momentum, at that same 6 month point, it'll just start to take off.
Okay, well, just hang on 1 second, because I want to clear something up first, before hearing like what this stealth, acting with stealth actually looks like. But so just to make sure I'm understanding, like, it sounds to me like you're talking about a situation where an OD practitioner or some kind of change practitioner is invited into an organization, maybe as an employee, maybe, under some kind of contract, because the organization says that it wants to change. And so they're saying this, they're not saying we want you to come in and refresh our computer systems or something. They're inviting you to come in and work on change. But when you come in, you realize that they say they want to change, but they're not at all ready for it. So to fulfill my contract, I have to act in this very special way.
That's right.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah. So systems are open to change, and often they know that they need to change. And then when you get there, they're not ready, or they believed that change was something entirely different than what you believe change is. So I get a lot of jobs that say we need someone who is going to come in and analyze business processes because that's what we think change is. And that that's a surface level change that is measurable and has a deliverable, but isn't actually going to change in the way that they know they need to change, but aren't ready to do.
Okay. So what comes up for me when you describe a possible change that way, I'm reminded of some research that I've been doing with some colleagues, and the research involved change in places like long-term care homes. And one of the things that we looked at was a group of people who were trying to introduce new and better ways of providing oral health care, like dental care, to residents in a long-term care home. And they thought that this was just a matter of introducing some new procedures, and that was it. And so, they came up with training programs and things like this. And before long, as they were trying to implement this change into a number of different long-term care homes, they came to the conclusion, this isn't working. Education alone, skill building is not working. And we have discovered to our surprise that in order for this change to really take hold, there needs to be a culture change in long-term care. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about then?
Yeah. So culture change, and culture has been described as habits repeated over time by many people. And so often the culture change is about behavioral change, and that's really hard to do, especially in healthcare where it's complex, where the behavior is happening in many parts of the system with many different types of people in many different types of roles. And often what happens at the beginning of a process and what happens at the end of a process, those people involved in that chain have no insight as to what even that beginning part looks like. They don't interact with those people. They don't know what their jobs are. And they have no insight into how the work at the beginning affects the work at the end. And so to change long-term patterns of behavior and habits that people have created involves getting many different types of stakeholders together to have in-depth conversations about what's happening. And that's extremely difficult to do. Even just getting those people together and in a room to have a conversation is the kind of change we're talking about, which is miles apart from analyze a business process. And so that requires some stealth.
Okay. So tell us about stealth then. Like it sounds like you're talking about needing to create the conditions for people even to get started. So how do you do that? What does that look like?
So actually, I'm just going to pull up. So I had a few key principles that I kind of use. So I found, I'm just going to go through them, that the stronger the barriers to change, the simpler the interventions for weakening them. And so let's take healthcare, for example. You have strong barriers to change in the way that organizational system is set up. It's very bureaucratic. It's very hierarchical. There's a hierarchy for a reason. It's expert driven, and those systems have a ton of accountabilities to bodies external to them. So licensing people, the government, funding bodies. And so that makes an interventionist job extremely difficult to do. But if you are, so the simpler the interventions for weakening them, I mean, things like standing in line at the Tim Hortons and talking to doctors. Because someone like me coming into an organization like that, the people that you really need to engage are doctors, and they are notoriously busy, inaccessible. Why are they talking to me? And so I have a lot of conversations in the elevator. And so building those little micro relationships is an important place to start. So things like that, when you're getting creative about how simple can my intervention be here, the stronger these barriers are. And I think an important point of note is that when you have this, the more bureaucratic the organization, the more hierarchical it is, the stronger the informal networks are, because that's how people have learned to get things done. And you need to infiltrate those. So that's stealthy. Building credibility quickly is important. So if you have been hired on to, say, analyze the business process or something that has a deliverable, because that's what people feel safe assigning work towards, is like, what can we see at the end? Do that and do it quickly and do it well and build credibility with people as a person who's going to get things done on time and deliver in a way that they've respected their colleagues and built trust with people. And that trust you've built and the credibility will earn you the right to do a little riskier things later on. Okay. My next point is participative processes are powerful tools. If you get a chance to use them, use them. So if you're looking at, a World Cafe or a top process, let's say you have a little group of people who are, maybe a little group of administrative assistants I've found want to engage, are excited to engage in something, have the freedom in the organization to do something a little bit out of the box because no one's really watching them that closely. Use those. And often when you do something like that, you will quickly find that people are curious. and they want to be engaged in something like that. And that is because my next point is that people talk, and you should use organizational gossip to your advantage. So instead of trying to eradicate it, which I think a lot of people are trying to do, because gossip is not the nicest part of organizational life, but it is a part of organizational life that I don't think is going anywhere and can be used strategically. So if you know the people in the organization that within 5 minutes of talking to you are going to go talk to 10 other people about what you just said, invite them and do something interesting that they are going to, whether they speak negatively or positively about what you did, people are going to be curious and they'll probably come out. Trust that principle of diffusion. So let's say 10 people liked what you did and they talked to 10 other people. Within 3 months, the organization is going to be buzzing about what's going on, especially if it's new and interesting and different, and especially if it's working and creating results. And creating results that people aren't used to seeing usually. So if you, for instance, get doctors and anesthesiologists in a room talking together and they come out with something innovative just because you've broken down a barrier to the way they usually work, that's going to get you noticed. And then the last point is, once you get noticed, then what will happen is that layer of an organization that is supposed to be in charge of things, so managers, leadership, executive, that strata of people, will want to try to crush that, not intentionally, but their job is to control. And they've been hired to control. And these types of processes, when you're working in, what we know in the business to be DP2 kinds of environments, so more self-directed, more self-managed, more collaborative, that is very threatening because it starts to build momentum very quickly, and people want to break out of the boundaries that they're used to having in their roles. And as a manager or organizational leader, you don't want that to get too out of hand, because maybe your job is to protect the reputation of your organization or protect the funding of your organization, and that's allowed. And so when doing this work, it's important to engage that level of authority in a productive way. The temptation is to resist it. So when organizational leaders say, you need to stop doing that, or you need to now come and check with me before you do these things, people are now used to having a little bit more freedom. They feel a little bit more empowered. They don't want to do that. Very important to counterintuitively engage that level of authority in a way where they feel really respected and included, and like their authority is still being maintained.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I love what you're talking about. I'm picturing for myself some of the larger, let's say, larger bureaucratic organizations that I've consulted to over my career, healthcare organizations, but also things like insurance companies and banks, large, bureaucratic organizations that maybe aren't quite as agile as they would like to be.
Yeah.
And so I hear you talking about the need to create relationships, to create trust, to be opportunistic in how you create relationships. Use the example of the elevator, the lineup for Tim Hortons, making use of the informal communication channels and so on. And I was really intrigued by that last point about how one interacts, how someone whose job who's been contracted to bring about change, and in the course of trying to help the organization change, you discover that the top level, which is signing your checks, which sanctioned you coming in, that ends up being where the most formidable, some people like to use the word resistance, comes from. And you somehow need to engage with them in order to keep the project moving forward. And so I'm curious, I have a hunch that some of the people listening to us are going to be curious about this too, that on the one hand, we need to be firm with those senior leaders that this is what you've paid me for, and this is the direction that you need to go in order to achieve the objectives that you set out. And yet they have that very legitimate, very natural worry that, oh my goodness, this change means I won't be able to exert the control over this, chaotic social system. And I feel like that's my job. My job is to keep things under control.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you can say a little bit more about that, what your experience has been to reassure and not to manipulate, but to reassure and to engage productively with people at senior levels when they experience those qualms about, the movement toward a more participative, more agile, more democratic organization.
So I think maybe it was you that taught me about embracing resistance. And I'll embrace the resistance. It's not, I experience it as something that's really true and valid. And I think that because of maybe, or people I know who are change agents and interveners, we come from a certain ethos of changing the status quo and power to the people. And that can make you have a bias that maybe you didn't intentionally realize was there against that level of power and authority, and wanting to change it and saying, you're not as democratic as you could be. And you kind of it's a take down the man approach. And that can backfire on you because they do have legitimate reasons for being resistant. And I've found that most resistance, when you tap into it, is coming from a very valid place. And there's a good reason people are resisting. When they feel understood in that resistance, it changes. So that layer of an organization really does have legitimate concerns and fears and reasons that they're pushing back and want to control, especially because, as you said, that's their job. That's what they were hired for, is to control and manage the organization. And the stakes are very high for them. And so, it comes at real, actual risk for them to do something risky, which this is, and it does get chaotic and it is uncontrollable. And the more democratic an organization, the less manageable it becomes, because people feel suddenly empowered to act without consulting. And building that consultation, that I guess that desire to consult other people is an important part of what you're building. So teaching leaders to consult with their employees and teaching employees to consult with leaders is a skill to try to build into your interventions. People don't like it because it takes longer. It is longer. It takes a lot longer to ask everybody what you should do than to just do it. And so leadership really doesn't like that because it slows things down. And part of the reason sometimes that they've gotten their job that they've gotten is because they could move quickly. They drove organizational change or priorities. They delivered and they did it fast. Mm-hmm. And so now you're asking them to essentially what you're doing is saying the reason that you got this job in the first place over many, many years of building a career is now no longer what we want you to do at all. Yeah. And you're going to be unskilled and you're going to feel incompetent, and people might see you as incompetent. And so I've found you really need to support leadership more than everybody else in that change and help them to still feel competent, still feel skilled, still feel respected by everybody in order to bring them on board. And you're the person leading change, but it's helpful to bring that layer along with you. So if you're organizing something, say, me and the executive director are doing this together, give them the skills to facilitate, help them, teach them the participative process that you're using and let them lead it with your guidance.
Okay.
Keep them in a leadership role, but differently.
So, there's a couple of things that I'm curious about. There's these dilemmas mm-hmm. that we face when, as I've said to my students many times, that when we're invited in to a bureaucratic organization that still has at least one foot in the 1950s, basically, mm-hmm. and I don't mean that in a disparaging way, really. The foot is in there because those methods and approaches and stances were so effective for such a long time. And so, really believing that the time has come to, embrace something new can be rather challenging. So one thing that comes up for me is that, often when I'm at the very beginning of a process with a new organization, one of the things that I'm thinking about is, these people that I'm speaking with may not
fully appreciate what it is that they're asking for. So the first step into the new is always from the old. And so they're doing their best to imagine this new way of being that they are contracting with me to help them create. They're doing their best to imagine it, but I'm not sure from, what I'm hearing them say that they've really thought it through and they're really able to picture some of the big changes that may end up being uncomfortable for them, the sorts of things that you've been alluding to. And so one of the things that comes up for me is I think to myself, I need to include in this contracting process, in our conversations, some statements that will get some of these things on the table. So they're there for them now. It's too early to talk through all of the implications, but they need to be on the table. They need to be part of our conversation right from the start. So for example, in the kind of work that I do, there's often a pretty important data gathering element to it. I've worked with organizations where the senior leaders believe any data that I gather will belong to them and I will turn it over to them. And so they'll be able to see who said what. And so right at the start, I say, if there's going to be data gathering, that's going to be entirely confidential. And the raw data that I gathered is not a deliverable. You're not going to get that. And I explain to them why. I explain to them that we're going to get a much more productive data set if people understand that, their identity is going to be protected and they can be really honest and not worry about repercussions. And usually senior managers are I found anyhow, are okay with that. They may be a little surprised, but they understand that, oh yeah, we're going to get better data that way. And then also, you mentioned, so I'm going to invite you to just say what you want about what I'm saying, but I just want to mention one other thing. You mentioned, I love this. You mentioned how often in contracting at the beginning, people are thinking about this road of change in sort of an old way. And they're thinking, they're not seeing that where we're going is toward, you might say grandly, a new way of being, new fundamental processes, new fundamental ways of thinking. That's where this road is leading. And instead, they're thinking in kind of old style, 1980s, early 1990s project terms with deliverables. Yeah. So here's what we're going to do. And I love that you say, do it, just do it, and do it well, and you're going to get credibility that way. That makes good sense to me. Another thing also that occurs to me is, and in doing it, I want to start in the process of us working together. I want to start introducing some of the implications of where they're going. So if they say they want to be more agile and they want to be more collaborative, they want to be more team-based and so on, I want to make sure that some of those things are part of the process of working together so they can start experiencing them fairly early. Now, I'm not sure if that's consistent with the sorts of things that you were saying, so I want to just invite you to respond.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Do what they asked you to do, and then do what you want to do also, and get results for both, and show results. I found, so when I was starting out, I just worked with a lot of people for free that were nonprofits, mostly because people who have less to lose are much more willing to take risks. But that was probably the most valuable part of my career because I had later on evidence that I could then take to different people and show them. And I found that what really mitigates that anxiety. So what they hired you to do this thing that has a deliverable, the thing that doesn't have the deliverable and seems a little riskier makes people anxious. But what mitigates anxiety is actually showing people what comes next on the road. So if you have examples from a different piece of work that you've done that you can bring in and say, look, I want to try this. Here's the results I've gotten. Here's evidence. I've done it with 10 other organizations and I'm going to show you on paper what happened. That can be used as a deliverable.
Okay. To
get you in the door to do something a little bit more innovative in that organization. And you start small and low risk. And build credibility that way too. So while I'm doing what they told me to do, I'm also saying, could I meet with 6 people who you think maybe want an extra project to do this event where we're going to talk about employee wellness, which usually people are fine with because it's trendy right now. it's useful, and it's really not going to threaten anybody in any way. And so you do that with the people, put out an open call. The people that come want to be there. But it's the processes you're using, and the ways that you're saying, we're going to gather data in a different way than you're used to doing. And when they see the results from that, that's when they'll let you do it again.
Okay.
In a more high stakes project. So as you're doing the thing you were contracted for, look for opportunities to do the thing that the organization says they need, but maybe they're not ready for. And just like you said, it's sometimes simply because they can't imagine it. It requires a lot of imagination, and maybe you can't go there because they've never seen it. So help them to see it. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. Edgar Schein says something about that, about how the job of the consultant, the organizational consultant, and of course he's talking about people operating from what he calls a process consultation stance. He says that our job is not to tell people things, our job is to show them things. Mm-hmm. And I've always found that to be kind of a powerful sort of distinction to make. So yeah, this, I want to dig into this more with you at some point. And in fact, there's a couple of other people that have been in contact with me who also want to talk about consulting in, as one person put it, highly resistant environments. So where you're both invited in and you're pushed out at the same time. I've had a number of experiences like that as well, and that kind of thing reminds me of the work of the growing body of work of Keegan and Leahy, who have the immunity to change model, and that's really fundamental to their model. The idea that people want to change, and they also, though, are drawn in a different direction that undermines the change. And they have this thing where they talk about how often change processes are like having one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake at the same time.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
So yeah, it's kind of interesting. But look, one last thing I'm curious about. Yep. And this is sort of going a little bit outside of what we've been talking about, but this kind of work, people who try to define this kind of work, almost always in their effort to define the work, they say something about how, and this organizational change work is informed by behavioral science. So we draw on relevant behavioral science to help us understand the social phenomena that we encounter in workplaces, and to help us, craft interventions that are both suitable for the local, but also backed up by, whatever scientific evidence there is. And so I'm curious at this point right now, what behavioral science are you most curious about, and are you tending to dip into these days?
I'm really loving how structures inform behaviors, and saying, people are purposeful. I'm going to draw on the work of Marilyn Emery and Fred Emery here. People are purposeful. They have agency. If you left them to their own devices, they would be drawn towards homonomy, beauty, autonomy, and the other one. But people are driven in a certain direction that is innately human. They want certain things, but the structures that we put them in can change that. It alters how they naturally want to be. So when you, for instance, and I do a lot of work in bureaucratic hierarchies, specifically because I like the way that drives behavior. I like to watch it, and then I like to watch it change when you alter that structure. Because I really think that it imposes limits on people that are not how people want to be. And so when you get people saying things like, I have a toxic workplace, or we can't figure out our roles and responsibilities, or we have communication issues, I think a lot of that is just driven by the way that we design our organizations. And I think people have divorced themselves from the fact that we actually design organizations. Not that they have to be a certain way or that they come that way. People built those in the post-war era for a reason, and that's what stuck. But it doesn't necessarily mean that's the way it has to be, because people design those themselves. And so I'm interested in, how do you get people to become conscious of the fact that they build these things for them to work in. And how do we help people to build these in a way that creates more positive behavioral interactions and creates better results at work?
Right. Yeah. So maybe I'll just make one more comment and invite you to reply. Yeah, when you talk about that, about your interest in structure and the way that structure influences behavior, yeah, one of the things that comes up for me, and this is based on some research that I've been doing with some people, and we're just in the process of reporting the results, is the way that people who are interested in bringing about change often will come together in order to create a temporary structure of some kind that will, you might say, enable and support the work of change within this larger, somewhat supportive system, but also possibly, somewhat reluctant system, to accept the changes that are going on. I find that very interesting. If you look at the dialogical OD guys, they talk about the creation of a container. And usually they're talking about, coming together in a meeting or something like this. And first we create the container. But it does seem to me that those of us who work on change in processes that go on for, month after month after month, we are creating a little temporary social structure in the form of the project team or the governance process for a large change endeavor that itself is going to set some of its own rules and is going to start creating a kind of culture for the change process that is going to be challenging the larger culture of the organization.
Yeah, I agree. That's what we're doing.
Okay.
And that's partly, I think, because that is the limit maybe of the field right now, is because we're often working in those kinds of structures. The reason that those little containers get created and then simultaneously resisted is because the structure around it was developed that way, right? So sometimes those, let's say the top brass in a organization that you're working in is resisting, that's the way that organization was designed for them, right? If they didn't hold those positions in that kind of a structure, they might be behaving totally differently towards what you're trying to do. So I think, yeah, understanding that is important, but I think that maybe some of the work I'm interested in is how do you break beyond the limits of the intervener at this point, which is to go into organizations, create these little containers. Hopefully it creates a culture or a pocket of a culture in an organization that people can learn from, and then it changes the organization. I don't know what that is, but it's interesting to me.
Yeah. Well, me too. Yeah. And with that, Emma, I want to thank you for taking this time. You can be sure I'm going to be back in touch to see if you will come and share some more of your experiences and ideas with us. But for now, thank you very much. I appreciate this.
Thank you. It's been great talking to you.
Okay.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed hearing from Emma as she told us about her approach to using stealth when working with large organizations that aspire to changes, but as of yet don't necessarily fully grasp all of the implications of making the changes that they are talking about. Emma, by the way, has said that she'd be very happy to answer questions, and she is sharing her email address with you here. I want to just close by saying once again that for those of you who are interested in learning more about the Human Systems Intervention Master's Program at Concordia University, a simple way to do that would be simply to Google these words, Google Human Systems Intervention and Concordia, and that should lead you to the portion of the website that talks about that particular program, where you can read about it and also get in touch with some of the faculty who would be very happy to answer your questions. That's all for now. Please check in again in a few weeks. We will be posting these videos regularly, and another one will be up before too long.